Hi, my name is Joshua Becker, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Kellogg School of Management in Chicago, and I'll be starting this fall on faculty at the UCL School of Management in London. And prior to becoming a researcher, I was actually a practitioner. I worked as a mediator. Now, people often think about mediation in association with things like dispute resolution or conflict resolution. Now, really, what a mediator does is they bring a process, and that process has been designed to try to get the best decision outcomes for a group. Now, as I moved into research, I carried this interest in processes with me, and I became a really problem-oriented researcher. And the problem that interests me is this: how can teams, organizations, and societies make good decisions? Now, a really common perspective for both scholars and practitioners is that you get the best decisions out of a group of people if you keep those people independent. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is why that's not always true and how you can sometimes get better decisions out of the collective intelligence of interacting people than you can out of the collected intelligence of independent individuals. Now, before I get too far into this, I'd like to remark that decision-making or collective intelligence is an enormously complex process. In fact, it's not really one process, it's many processes. So I think about this space as divided up into three distinct types of group tasks. You've got idea generation, idea evaluation, and idea selection. Now, idea generation is like brainstorming. You're making a decision and you have to think about all the different ways you might resolve that decision. So for example, one particularly popular use of crowdsourcing, which is a growing tactic for harnessing collective intelligence, is to have the customers of a company actually contribute new ideas for products that company might make. So this type of crowdsourcing is idea generation. Now, once you have all those ideas, you need to decide how good they are. So now you've moved into the idea evaluation phase. And this is where my research really comes in. And the way I think of idea evaluation is in terms of the formation of numeric estimates. So numeric estimates include answers to questions like, how many units will this new product sell in the first year? Or if I'm making some investment, what percentage return do I think I can get on my investment? Or if I'm a physician, I have to form estimates like, what's the probability that this patient has heart disease? Now, once you have all these ideas and you've evaluated them, now you need to actually think about picking some ideas. So in an optimal scenario, all the ideas have clearly determined payoffs, and you just pick the idea with the best payoff. However, we don't live in an optimal world, and people may either disagree about what's important, so what kinds of questions they should even be asking, or they might disagree about, some of the factual details. Maybe not everybody comes up with the same estimate. So that's why I include idea selection as a distinct part of collective intelligence. Now, I mentioned this framework just to give you an idea of the broader context in which the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today fits in, and that's specifically the area of idea evaluation or numeric estimate formation. Now, the really exciting thing about numeric estimates is that groups are capable of producing remarkably accurate numeric estimates, even when not one individual within the group knows the right answer. So this incredible phenomenon is known as the wisdom of crowds. And the intuitive explanation for how it works is that if you have a group of people and you keep those people independent, then since their beliefs are independent, their errors will also be independent. So the idea is that for every person who overestimates, there's another person who underestimates, and their errors cancel out in aggregate, and the truth is revealed. Now, the wisdom of crowds phenomenon, this statistical argument, is one reason for the popularity of the idea that you need to keep people independent. And it works in a lot of scenarios. So, for example, if you take physicians and instead of asking one physician, even if they're the most expert physician in the field, but instead ask a lot of physicians and take the average answer, you're going to get better diagnoses than the most accurate member of that group. So this crowdsourcing or collected intelligence approach to the wisdom of crowds works really well. But the problem is that people simply aren't independent in a lot of scenarios. If you think about something like organizational behavior, people in organizations talk and exchange and influence each other all the time. Or if you think about something like deliberative democracy, it's impossible to imagine a democratic decision made by a group of truly independent people, right? We talk, we influence each other, we tweet, we Facebook, we share information. So it's really important to understand how social processes, social influence, social information exchange shapes the accuracy of group beliefs. Now, a real behavioral concern is that when people talk to each other, they generate things like herding behavior or groupthink. There are a myriad of dangerous, risky types of dynamics associated with group behavior, which is another reason why the perspective is so popular that you get the best decisions out of independent people. But it's also the reason why there's been a large interest in developing processes that try to allow people to communicate while mitigating the risks associated with things like groupthink. Far and above, one of the most popular processes to be developed was something called the Delphi method, named after the Oracle of Delphi. Now, there's a lot of different implementations of the Delphi method, but briefly put, the Delphi method allows people to communicate, share opinions, share information, but they don't do so directly, which lets them share information and influence each other without the types of normative or social pressures that often lead to things like groupthink. Now, this is really exciting if it actually lets people harness the benefits of collective intelligence, but the problem is that the empirical research, which is to say actual evidence on whether or not this works, is all over the place. There have been some researchers that argue that this Delphi method, which I'm just going to call numeric exchange, because at the end of the day, people are just sharing their numeric estimates, strictly informational. So there's some research that shows that this numeric exchange outperforms just unstructured discussion, which is to say people just sitting down at a table and having a conversation. So that would be evidence that these careful processes actually can mitigate the effects associated with groupthink. However, there's also evidence coming from other researchers that says that in fact, there's no problem with groupthink, and you get even better answers when you just let people talk freely around a table than when you try to run one of these careful numeric exchange or Delphi processes. And then there's yet other scholars and bodies of evidence that suggest that neither numeric exchange nor natural language discussion have any place in estimate formation, and they continue to argue for this collected intelligence paradigm and argue that any social information or exchange at all undermines belief accuracy. Now, the confusion in the existing research is so strong that in one review of experiments on group belief accuracy, Reed Hasty at the University of Chicago said, and I quote, "At present, the discrepancy in results must simply remain a puzzle." Now, this quote comes from a paper that was published in the 80s, and since then, there hasn't really been any work that I've seen that takes any steps towards clarifying this answer. So my goal is twofold. First, I want to understand why these apparently contradictory results would have emerged from these experiments. And more generally, I want to use that understanding to ask, how can we design processes that will allow groups to form the most accurate beliefs or the most accurate numeric estimates. And in order to do that, I'm actually going to take a step back and I'm going to ask a much more basic research question, which is this. Just in general, how does communication or information exchange actually shape belief accuracy? So what we're going to end up with is a perspective on social processes that makes us think differently about the wisdom of the crowds. What we're going to end up with is the realization that it's not simply a question of is social information good or bad for belief accuracy. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to develop a network perspective on belief formation. And when we take this network perspective and belief formation, we can start to understand why groups form the beliefs they do, why groups can sometimes produce remarkable collective intelligence, and why they sometimes can spectacularly fail to take advantage of all the information held in their members' heads. And what we're going to end up with is what I call a contingency theory of collective intelligence. Now remember, we're just looking at this idea evaluation part of the space, but even within idea evaluation, it turns out that whether you allow social interaction and what type of process you choose depends on a number of factors. Over the course of these next few videos, I'm going to show how group features like the relationship between accuracy and stubbornness, or the patterns of who talks a lot and who doesn't talk a lot. I'm going to show how these group features can shape outcomes. I'm going to show how features of the process, so whether you talk in just unstructured communication, like people sitting around a table, or whether you use a more structured numeric exchange process. I'm going to talk about how these process features can change outcomes. And I'm going to talk about how task features can shape outcomes, like statistical properties of the kinds of questions that you're asking, or even how you frame the question. And what we're going to end up with is a few practical recommendations for how you can structure your next group decision-making process. One key takeaway is that we want to create structures that promote equal participation. And I'm going to talk more about how we've come to believe this and how this can emerge in different group processes. Another strategy is to encourage information sharing, but not opinion sharing. I'll talk about that point in the last video, and I'll go into more detail there on what I mean by that. And I'm also going to talk in the last video about a dual role for groups as either information aggregators or groups as decision makers. I'm going to expand upon all of these points in the next few videos.